Wasson Dishnakas Nimki Dodam Waganak Singin Doda Bendakus Mampi Minoa Mkiden Dadis Owashtanong Chiwa Sa Jawanong. So I'm Thunder Clan. My name is Wasson, which means light all around. And my tribe I come from is right here in the land of the crooked tree. And I was born way far south of here in the Grand Rapids area. And thanks for everybody coming out. I thought maybe it might be a good idea to talk, and I'd share a little bit about why I know stories are told when there's snow on the ground. And so we wait for winter time for these things to happen. As a Thunder Clan person, I've learned a lot about my clan. And after getting my name and learning about my name and what that means and the story that came with my name. And I know that there's things that mean us harm that is under the ground and it can come out and mess with us. We'll just say it like that. Try and manipulate the community in some way. But Nimki Benashiak, the thunderbird, will come and it shoots lightning from the wings and chases those back down under the ground and protects the people. And when the thunderbird takes off and has other work to do in other areas, it's because the snow has come and the snow holds those things down and protects us. And it's a great time for most of creation to go to sleep. It's a rest period. And it's a time that there's not a lot of work as far as outdoor work for our people to do. And so this is the time where we tell stories, not during planting time, and not during the time when the fish are running, and not during the time that we're gathering syrup or sap. There's too much work to be done to sit around and tell stories. So winter time is the time to tell stories. And a storyteller once told me that the kids would all be sitting in a round-shaped wigwam, not unlike this room, and they would tell stories, and at a certain point in the stories, to bring emphasis to it, they throw popcorn in the fire. And when the popcorn pops, it pops out of the fire, and the kids would all be grabbing for the popcorn. That is significant. So story time has been a big part of our culture since most of our language doesn't have a written alphabet system. And so we tell these stories, and sometimes we tell them over and over and over again, and you can hear the same story, but you'll hear different parts of it every time that you hear it. So the first story that I was going to talk about was during the time of the changing leaves. It's really poetic, and it's a shame that I'm doing this in Jagannashmuan because it loses some of the poetic meaning when I speak in English rather than in Anishinaabemowin. But I don't know how to tell these stories completely in Anishinaabemowin. I'm not that good yet. So it was during the time of the changing leaves, which means it was fall time. And in the fall time, it's most often that the Mins take off into the bush to go hunting and bring wias back that you're going to need or meat that you're going to need throughout the winter. And when the Mins go off into the bush, sometimes they'd be gone for more than a month until there's enough animals to bring back to share amongst everybody. It wasn't the way that we're hunting nowadays, where someone goes and hunts and they get an animal and they put it in their freezer. In those days, if someone got an animal, then it was parted out with everyone. And there's a pecking order of how that's taken care of. In our community today, there's still some Mins that do that. They take care of the widows, those ones that don't have. So their first kill is divvied up and given away. Every year I'm given fish and weas to this day. So there's some families that are still following those traditions. And there was this little boy, and he wanted to go hunting with the men's, the uncles, the dads of the village. And they kept telling him, no, you're too young yet. You're too young. There's still more that you need to learn. You see, because the little boys stay at the hip of their moms and their grandmas and their aunties, and the little boys learn how to do women's work in their first years of life. That way they know how to pick a good wife and what to look for. So there's roles, different roles for men and women in our community, but at first they did both. And young boys stay real close to their mom and they do women's work. So they learned how to weave. They learned all of these different things that are known nowadays as more women's, or in those days as women's work. And so this little boy thought that he was old enough and big enough. He wanted to go with the men's because they were gone for a long time. And it sounds like a heck of an adventure. Because then they come back and they tell all of these great stories about meeting the different tribes out in the world, out beyond their boundaries, and they would talk about their interactions with the earth and all of the Creator's creations that have been given to us. And he wanted to be part of that really bad. And they said, no, not yet. You're still too young. Well, he wasn't ready to hear that. Really kind of angered him, and he wanted to prove that he was good enough. And so when the men's got all of their gear ready and ready to take off, they took with them everything that they might need and everything that they're for sure gonna need. And in those days, our people used to put food caches in places along on the journey. And so they can walk so far, make a camp, and dig up the food cache. And there'd be all the supplies that they need. That way they don't have to lug everything with them. This is back in the dog days, what we call the dog days. It was before horses. Okay, so this is like before contact. And dogs carried our burdens and not horses. We didn't have horses here. And so that was a hard thing to do, to carry around all the food that you're gonna need for that whole time. So when they got to that one place, they could dig up their food cache and then camp there and hunt there and carry on and so forth, and then maybe move to the next one and always leave some along the way. Well, these men have this memorized of where these places are so that other tribes can't find them and cash in on their food cache. So they took off and this boy was just distraught. So he ran away. And he tried to stay far enough behind them that they wouldn't see that he was lagging behind. But, and so more distance became between him and his village. And then more distance came between him and the hunters until he lost track of them. And then he got lost out there in the bush. Well, for Anishinaabeg people in those days, to be one person alone is almost a death sentence in itself. The Creator made us to need one another. And that's why our bodies fit so nicely together. And that's why we have moms and dads and uncles and aunts and siblings to help take care of each other, and lived in villages, not separate places. And he found himself all alone. And of course, he got a little bit of a panic come in him as nightfall came. And he just slept outside in the fall, just outside. Well, you know how cold it can get frosty out there. And he didn't bring enough stuff. He didn't know well enough to bring all of the supplies he needed. He certainly didn't have enough food. And then he tried to catch up and tried to see signs. Well, he hadn't been taught these things yet. So he's just wandering around in the woods, not knowing about where the food cache is. And he starts to cough. He's getting sick. The hunters have no idea that he was following them. The village is going out of their mind crazy, thinking, that he must have run off with them. So nobody's really looking for him. And he's lost out in the woods all by himself. Well, he knew enough as being next to his mother's hip to make a dwelling. So he made himself a small little shelter, a wigwam. He covered it as best as he could, being such a little boy. And he made an opening up there at the top. And he had started a small fire because it's getting cold. This is after several days being out in the element, and he's getting sicker and sicker and not enough food to eat. The outcome doesn't look all that good for this boy. And nobody knows where he is, and he doesn't know where he is. And he lays on the floor of this wigwam, which is cold, because in Anishinaabe, we don't sleep like right on the ground. We have little racks that we built to keep us up and insulated from the ground. And they put cedar bough down and maybe a cedar mat and some hides so that you're always nice and comfortable. He had none of those things. All he had was leaves and twigs and a few things that he took on his back. And he's hungry. And he's sick, he's getting a fever, and he's laying there, and now he's so weak, he can't get up and get any more firewood. Well, if you've ever been out in the bush and you try and keep a fire going, that's a full-time job, especially when you don't have the right tools, to cut all that wood. Just to keep the fire going is a full-time job. The boy, it becomes clear to him. He's looking around. He's like, this isn't, I need help. I need help. And I don't know what to do. And he's just laying in the wigwam, too weak to get up and get firewood. And he calls out loud. He says, someone will come and help me. Someone come and help me, not knowing that his intent was just to speak out. But when you speak in Anishinaabe, all of creation can hear it. It's a sacred language. And so all of creation was listening to this little boy call out for help. Someone will come and help me. And the trees had heard him. Well, in these days, we could speak the same language as creation. Creation could hear us, and we could hear creation. And there was this little white bird that heard him and came to the top of the smoke hole of the wigwam and looked down in there at this pitiful little sick little boy who was dehydrated and feverish and sick, and said, holy smokes, this boy needs some help for sure. And goes down and goes like this with the wings. Said, oh good, there's a little bit of coal down in the ashes of what was left of his fire. And without hesitation, that little bird went out into the forest and collected what twigs and leaves it could in its beak and brought it down to the coals in the bottom of the fire pit. It was going like this. And sure enough, it got it burning. But only it burned fast because they were just little twigs. So the little bird was busy running off into the forest and dropping twigs on there and getting it started again. Little sparks coming up and like little fireflies, and coming up and running back. In between there had found a leaf that wasn't quite all dried up, and it was like a little cup. And so the bird had gone to the stream and got a couple of drops of water in that leaf and brought it to the boy. And we all know that water is medicine, especially when done in with so much emphasis on how important it was. The bird knew how important it was, and the boy had called for help. And the little white bird brought it to the boy, and a couple of drops felt like, it's so good, because he was so thirsty he hadn't gotten up and gotten his own water. So in between bringing little couple drops of water to the boy's lips, keep on coming down through the smoke hole and back and forth and putting twigs and getting it started, and it would fire up real quick, but it had warmed the boy up a little bit. And the bird was sitting up there and said, I think I'm going to be okay. This had gone on like day and night for like a whole day, until the boy got his strength back from that little bit of water that was like medicine to him. And the fire had warmed him, because when you got a fever, you feel so cold. Said, oh my, what happened to little white bird? Said, oh no, look at what happened to your beautiful white feathers. Got singed from the sparks coming up and kept going like that, and got stuck on his chest. And the bird kind of picked and picked and picked and picked at it, and it just spread, and it turned burnt orange. And the whole breast on that was burnt orange. It says, oh, no matter. It's all right. I like this color, trying not to feel bad about the beautiful white feathers that are now burnt orange. And they spoke to one another, and the bird had given him encouragement and said, I will stay with you, knowing that this little boy needed help. And he had gotten up, and his arrow finally found its way to some food. And he shot it, brought it back, made himself a meal out of it. And the bird said, I'll show you your way back home. Follow me. Follow me, and I know where your village is. And so the boy followed the bird with the burnt orange chest all the way back home. And oh man, were they glad to see him. He almost died. Can you imagine all the aunties and the mom coming up? You'd think, they just hold him so tight, and glad that he was alive. He'd been gone for an awful long time. The hunters were still far away. The uncles and the dads were still far away. And that bird had told him, said, just to make sure, and they had created a bond between them, said, I'll always make my home close to where your village is, and we could always help each other out. And of course, that's the robin, what we know as the robin today. And that's why the robin always makes a nest not far from where the Anishinaabeg people are. Right here in the entranceway of our building here, I noticed there's a nest up there in the rafters. And it made me think of that story. So that's the end of one little story. Then I got another one about birds. I like birds. So it's more on the contemporary side. One day when I was writing, my dad was like Petersburg. My grandma was Mary Petersburg. And we didn't have air conditioning. But my dad had air conditioning in the car. So when it got really hot, we'd drive around and enjoy air conditioning in the car. And I'd sit in the back seat of the car, and my dad and grandma, we'd just drive around and maybe visit people or just drive around and look at old, old, old places that they used to visit when they were younger. And we were driving around out in the country, and I said out loud, because I saw a whole bunch of crows up in the tree, and it was harvest time for the corn. And you ever see a tree and it's just black with crows? It's right next to the farmer's field. And I said out loud to my grandma, because they were all talking at once, They're all squawking. And I said to my grandma, I wonder what they're saying, you know. And I was just being a little kid, just speaking out loud, not really expecting an answer. But she gave me one. And she told me this story. She says, well, I know what they're talking about. We're still driving around in the car. Well, do tell, Grandma. She said, they're complaining and they're making a new plan. I said, oh. She said, there was a time when the Anishinaabe people were the only farmers here. And they would always make an offering to Andekuk, the crows. They'd always give them an offering. Because as the story goes, they claimed responsibility of bringing the first corn seed from creation far in the sky down and brought it to the people. And in return, the people always gave an offering back to the crows every year. And as time gone on, the people started thinking, well, I'm a good farmer and I deserve all this corn. And they quit putting the offering down for the crows. And the crows are up there making a plan. And they're all talking at once. And they said, this isn't going to happen to us, because they're worried about how they're going to get through the winter. And they're all up there talking at the same time. And they said, okay, all you crows on this branch, you be in charge of planting the corn. We will steal some of that corn and we'll save it and not eat it, and we'll put it out there. And then you guys, you'll be in charge of planting it. And you guys over here on this branch, you guys make a plan about how you're going to care for it. How you can keep the weeds away from there, make sure that it has enough water. All you guys figure out your plan over there. And then these guys over here on this branch, you figure out how we're going to harvest that corn. And then where we're going to store it and all the things. You guys make a plan about that. And then you guys over here, you have to figure out how we're going to distribute that corn. And oh, what a glorious time we're going to have next winter. We're not going to have to scrounge for anything. We're all going to have corn. Corn for everybody. And all equal amounts. It's all going to be a grand. So they're all up there talking, making their plan about how next year is going to be different. But it happens every year. Because when the corn comes up and they steal the corn, they say, oh, why should we worry about tomorrow when we have so much corn today? And so Grandma says, you should not live like the crows. You should always plan for tomorrow and and follow through with your plan. You make your goal and then you follow through. I cherish that story from my grandma because she was telling me to trust my plan and to make my idea come to fruit by following through. So she said, don't live like the crows. I debated whether, and that's the end of that story. Kijita, miswe. Then I did want to tell you on a more contemporary form, because I'm a weaver. And there was a really significant happening that happened this last August. And I'd like to tell all of the tribe about that. And it's got to do with the Meskwaki. And I've been doing research with this First Nations girl for a few years now. And I got to know this grandma's weaving, this grandma named Mrs. Bill Leaf. It's her only English name. She had an Anishinaabe name, but her only English name was her husband's name. And she's really well documented woman. And she has just an amazing story. Well, I'm weaving bulrushes these days instead of black ash because emerald ash borer has wiped out most of the black ash trees, and what's left needs to go to seed because black ash only seeds every 5 to 7 years. And if there's any trees living, I want them to throw their seed and not make baskets. And so I'm investing in the future. That's why I pretty much quit making baskets. At least I'm not harvesting from here. I'm not harvesting at all. And so I turned my attention to other weaving, which is naknoshkon, or bulrush. And while I was doing the bulrush weaving and my First Nations friend was researching, come to find out that Mrs. Bill Leaf is probably one of the best documented weavers in all of these museums because she was one of the last bulrush weavers in our nation. One of the last, not the only one. But it's because of their history, the Meskwaki, and how they didn't end up going to government school and how that tradition stayed intact within their community for a good long time. And so what happened with the Meskwaki people, they were originally their land was around the Wisconsin, Minnesota area. And the Anishinaabe pushed them out. It was a great war. And we killed most of them and chased them out of there. And they turned and took refuge as best they could in Tama, Iowa, close to Tama. And when they went back to the government to get their annuity payments, because everybody was being accounted for in those days and being put on reservations. And at that time, we were fighting to just stay put. We did not want to be relocated to Kansas or Oklahoma or anywhere. We needed to stay in the land of our ancestors to watch over their graves. And we're just part of this land. So we were fighting to stay here, but the Meskwaki were pushed out. And when they got done there, they went to the government and said, well, we want our annuity payment over here in Tama, Iowa. And they said, the U.S. government said, what are you doing in Tama? Get your ass back over there. Excuse me. We can block that out. Get your damn back over there to Wisconsin where we told you to be. And they said, well, we can't go back there. They'll kill us. They were numbering less than 1,000 by the time they got to Tama. They said, we can't go back there. So, well, we didn't tell you to go to Tama, Iowa, government being all controlling the way they are. He said, then go to Kansas. Kansas? Man. So they've already had taken a lot of losses just being kicked out of their territory and making new territory in Tama. Now they're told they have to march all the way to to Kansas. So the ones that could did. And when they got there, they looked around and they go, oh no, 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 no. We're not staying here. Everybody is being shoved down there. And they've had war with some of these, right? So those old animosities are still alive. Besides, the landscape was nothing that they were used to. They're woodland people. They're looking around and they go, we can't live here. We're going to die here. So they went back. They went back to Tama. In the meantime, they had made friends with the white farmers in that area. And the white farmers went to, and this is a rare part of history, the white farmers elicited the help of the state officials or the region officials and said, let us keep our Indians, they called them in those days. And they said, why? Well, because they're good farmers. We want to keep them. Well, the women, as they were making their way, as they were getting pushed out of the woodlands, took seed with them from home. Wherever they ended, they were going to plant those seed. And you know, they changed the Iowan landscape forever by bringing woodland seed into Iowa. Things that didn't normally grow there are growing there now. One of those is Wigabatik, the basswood tree. It's not native to Iowa. And anytime you see a basswood tree in Iowa, it's because the Meskwaki brought them. The Red Earth people, they call themselves. And they said the farmers said, let us keep. So they went to bat to the federal government and said, let us keep our Indians. And the federal government said, well, where are they going to live? They got no land. And the farmers went back to the Meskwaki and said, well, if you guys have any money, and we'll get you some land. Well, they did. Part of the way they had money is they were making bulrush mats and selling them to the farmers. Plus they had no use for a lot of money, and getting paid by the farmers and then trading that out for money. They'd get paid in food and then trading that out. So those are just some of the ways. So they pooled up all their money as a community. And they said, well, we'll sell you these 400 acres of land. But in those days, this was before 1921, this is back in 1800s, they weren't citizens of the country and weren't allowed to be landowners. So the farmers had to buy the land and put it in their name and say, this is your settlement. Went back to the federal government and said they got land, give them their annuity payments. Let us keep our Indians. It's unlike any other history. It's a very unique and beautiful way that they ended up settling in that area. And after 21, then they transferred the land. After the Indians became citizens of our own country, the Meskwaki, they were able to hold title to that land. They still have that original 400 acres, which they live on today. And in the meantime, it was Mrs. Bill Leaf's grandmother in that generation that all of these things had happened. And they passed down that weaving tradition to her mother. And her mother passed it on down to her. Well, Mrs. Bill Leaf, in those days, and there's no, the Christianity hadn't creeped its way in there. They were still living in the old way. And in those days, to say that you were married, a boy would come to a girl's lodge, and if she invited him under the blanket, then they were married. If not, then he was chased out, and they're not married. Well, a boy had come to her lodge, and she chased him out. She was too young. She wasn't interested, chased him down the path. And he got upset about that. That's embarrassing, because he wanted to take her on as his wife. And so I guess some kind of love medicine was used on her. She was walking from one place to another. Next thing she knew, a couple days had gone by and she was in his lodge. Well, I guess you could say today, in today's terms, that would probably be called rape. And she came to her senses, gathered her things, and ran from that lodge and told her mother, who knew some of her own medicine. And the only part of the story that Pearl, her niece, or Pearl, her daughter, told in the transcript that I read is her mother took care of it and he died. So he's gone. But that's considered her first husband because they were under the same blanket. Then the second husband came around and it made sense. It was her true love. And so they became a couple. And she had a couple of boys and a girl, Pearl, and these two boys. And her brother is kind of hanging around. And then Pearl is the one telling Mrs. Bill Leaf's life story on the transcript. And she says that a great sickness had come over the community. Could have been TB, or it could have been smallpox. Who knows what it was, but it killed lots. And it got their numbers down to around 400. Her mother died. Her husband died. A lot of people in the community, it took out the elderly and the young, whatever the sickness was. They called it the Great Sickness. A lot of people died. And that was the one true love of her life. In the meantime, she's still weaving lots. Her sister died, and her sister had a daughter named Mary. And so she's only a young girl herself. She ended up taking on her sister's daughter and raised her as her own, but she's only 12 years younger than her. So they're more like sisters than that's her niece. But now her niece is now her daughter. So she's got her daughter Pearl, her niece, and these little boys. No husband. The brother is living there helping out. And she lives like that for a while. And we can tell from the census, their housing tradition had changed because you know how we live in round wigwams? They live in square ones. Yeah, they built them with corners on them. Part of the way that the census was taken was they had a certain criteria to say whether the people were civilized or not. And one of the ways that they would say they were civilized, did they have square houses? And so they made stick houses covered in bark the same way that we do here, but they were square. It's kind of unusual. That way the census taker could say, civilized. Maybe they got more annuity if they were more civilized. But they only lived in those in the summer months when the censuses were being taken. In the winter months, they went back in the bush and lived in their wigwams, back further in the bush. And all the time, Mary and Mrs. Bill Leaf started weaving together. And she had caught the attention of Mr. Bill Leaf. And he wanted to marry her. And she had no need for a man at that point. She figured it out. Strong woman, making lots of mats, bags. I see her weaving all over. And on top of that, our people, the woodland people, were seeking her out to make mats and bundles and bags for us, because our traditional line of knowledge was being interrupted by the boarding school And they weren't made to go to boarding school because they were landowners. And so they didn't have to go. But there was a boarding school in Tama, and they saw what was happening and the effects of what was happening to those kids as they came out. And they knew it wasn't good. So they had their own school and still do to this day. And so she's still making mats and she's teaching Mary. So her and Mary end up weaving. Pearl doesn't have a knack for it, which is her birth daughter. But her niece has a knack for it and becomes very well known as well. And in the meantime, anthropologists are coming and seeking out these traditional items, and she's one of the last known weavers. Mary ended up getting married and moved to Oklahoma, but never had children. But remember, that's in the days of sterilization. So she never had children of her own. And of course, Mrs. Bill Leaf ended up that she did accept Mr. Bill Leaf's proposal of marriage because he built her a house, one of those square ones with corners. Said, you know, that's a heck of a courtship. Here, I built you this house. How about if we be a couple now? And she was like, and this is how Pearl explained it. She said, yeah, but where will you live? No joke. And so he built another one right next door. Don't you love her? I just love this lady. Mrs. Bill Leaf said, yeah, but where will you live? Oh, well, he thought that he would live there. But she's independent enough where she doesn't need a man. So he built another house right next to it. She's still weaving. Mary was weaving with her. And her last weaving was in the 1950s. She was close to blind because every photo that we can find, she's got binoculars next to her weaving. So she was probably having a hard time, maybe cataracts, maybe things weren't clear. And in the end, she was telling the anthropologist to go to Mary in Oklahoma and have Mary weave. She was still weaving really well. And then she died. And so Mary was the only other one that was weaving. Of course, she was living in Oklahoma and she had no descendants. And then she died. And so that was the end of bulrush weaving for the Meskwaki people until August of 2019. A group of them came to Enjanabigagang, which is the name of my studio, in my backyard. And 6 of them came to reclaim the weaving and take it back home. And it was such a monumental event of healing between the Anishinaabe and the Meskwaki, because they came back to the woodland area where they were welcomed. And being descendants of the community of where Mrs. Bill Leaf, a very famous bulrush weaver, came from, it was a true honor to host them. And they were able to make a mat, dye the bulrushes, make a bag, learn the techniques, dye bulrushes, start another mat, and they took it home. And when they got home, they had a great community gathering where lots and lots of people came to see what they brought home. When they brought the bulrush weavings that they created at Enjanabigagang and the mat they started, they gave a war cry as they crossed the border back into their community to announce that they brought that information back. So I thought it was important that the Waganuk sing Bamatsachik, that the people from here, from this place, know about the bond that has been recreated with our ancient relatives, the Meskwaki people down in Tama, Iowa. It was truly a healing and beautiful experience. Glad to be part of it. Now, Niswe.